At 6:14 a.m., the metal door of the Fairfax storage unit groaned open. Frosted breath spilled into the corridor as two FBI technicians stepped inside, flashlights cutting through the cold dust. Box A27 was exactly where the source said it would be, and inside, wrapped in a grocery bag, held shut with yellowing tape, was the burned notebook. Half-charred pages, half-readable, enough to send a bolt of electricity through the bureau. On the first intact page, barely legible but unmistakable, was a name no one expected: Helen Vance, CIA Registry, 1963, 1977. Just a clerk, a quiet woman behind a desk, the kind you'd never look at twice. But the notebook didn't lie, and neither did the Soviet stamp faintly visible on the last surviving page. 4 hours later, in a windowless room beneath the Hoover Building, analysts sat with their backs straight, shoulders tight. A single photograph rested in the center of the table: Helen in her gray cardigan, ID badge clipped neatly, smiling the smile of someone who never meant to be remembered. "Run it again," the section chief said. The young analyst swallowed. "Sir." She had access to everything passing through the registry: personnel routes, dead drop schedules, travel rosters, alias renewals. The room fell silent. The registry wasn't glamorous, but it was the bloodstream of the agency. Every paper trail that protected every agent abroad passed through hands like hers. If she had turned even once, Moscow wouldn't have needed to penetrate CIA headquarters. The door was already open. The chief tapped the photo. "Then start from the beginning. How does a clerk become the most valuable mole the KGB never bragged about?" The projector hummed to life. A grainy slide appeared: Langley, 1964. The briefing officer cleared his throat. Before she became a traitor or a patriot, depending on who tells the story, Helen Vance was known for exactly one thing: she blended into the walls. And that, in the world of shadows, is where the most dangerous people like to live. The deeper the Bureau dug into Helen Vance's early years at Langley, the more unsettling the pattern became. She wasn't a ghost they wished she had been. Ghosts leave no footprints. Helen left perfect ones. Too perfect. Her personnel file showed punctuality so precise it bordered on mechanical. 0 reprimands. 0 late arrivals. 0 missed signatures. Supervisors rotated. Directors retired. Clerks transferred, but Helen remained, steady as a metronome. The kind of employee every bureaucracy quietly worships. But in espionage, perfection is suspicious. Her first assignment in 1964 placed her in the heart of the CIA registry, an archive of movement comings, goings, alias formations, safehouse rotations, and operational cables requiring cross-reference. To most, it was a clerical tomb. To the KGB, it was a gold vein. That raised the question: when did they notice her? Or did she notice them first? An analyst clicked to the next slide. Arlington, 1966. A bus stop. A woman with a scarf wrapped tight, facing away from the camera. The file name read, "Surveillance. Possible Soviet contact." "Is that her?" someone asked. "No confirmation," the presenter replied. But the timestamps overlap with her unexplained schedule gaps. 3 incidents over 11 months. The room shifted uneasily. Helen wasn't careless. She was controlled, disciplined, and discipline creates opportunities for handlers, for recruiters, for anyone looking to cultivate reliability. The Bureau's behavioral specialist leaned forward. She was the type who absorbed pressure without blinking. People like that draw intelligence officers like magnets. A theory began to form. Helen Vance wasn't chosen randomly. She was profiled, studied, and approached by someone who understood exactly what she lacked and exactly what she craved. The next file fed into the projector, its edges brittle with age. Subject: Vance. Helen's psychological assessment. Preliminary. A note scrawled at the bottom in pencil read, "Emotionally self-contained. possibly isolated. High loyalty drive. Vulnerable to attention-based manipulation. Attention, a currency deadlier than money during the Cold War. The section chief interlaced his fingers, staring at the screen. So, what pulled her in? The behavioral specialist answered quietly. Someone finally saw her. A chill settled over the table. Because in that world, being seen is never a gift. It's a recruitment strategy. And sometimes, the smallest recognition can open the largest breach. The breakthrough came from a document no one expected, a routine CIA shuttle maintenance report from 1967. Buried in the scanned paperwork was a list of passengers for a delayed return trip from the Pentagon Annex. Third row from the bottom. Vance, Helen R. Right below her name. Volkov, Anton S. Volkov. A Soviet economic attaché stationed at the embassy, officially. Unofficially, counterintelligence now believed he was a mid-tier KGB talent spotter with a specialty in cultivating low-visibility assets. But here was the problem. There was no record of Helen ever interacting with him. Yet their names appeared together in 2 more shuttle logs within the next 5 months. Coincidence? Unlikely. The Bureau reconstructed the scene. A rain-soaked evening in late October, the shuttle half empty, windshield wipers thudding a slow rhythm. Helen sat with her usual posture, straight-backed, hands folded, eyes fixed on the middle distance. Volkov boarded last, shaking droplets from his coat, scanning the seats with casual precision. He chose the one beside her. No words were recorded, no surveillance noted. But the proximity alone told the story. Volkov worked with silence. He waited for patterns to form routines, vulnerabilities, predictable routes, and Helen had routines carved in stone. Investigators found the next breadcrumb in a receipts ledger from a small diner in Foggy Bottom. Over 3 years, Helen regularly ordered the same meal. Black coffee, oatmeal, no sugar. But starting in early 1968, a second coffee began showing up on the tab, always at the same table, always paid under her check signature. So either she got hungrier, one analyst joked darkly, or she wasn't alone. They cross-referenced the timing with embassy movement logs. Each of those mornings matched days when Volkov filed late arrival notices. The picture sharpened. A subtle companionship, predictable but deniable. The behavioral specialist reviewed the receipts and murmured, "He didn't seduce her. He patterned her. He mirrored her rhythm until she felt understood." Attention-based manipulation weaponized with patience. By late 1968, analysts believed the first soft probe occurred. A comment, a small favor, perhaps an innocuous question about her workday. Nothing too direct, nothing that would scare her, just enough to mark the first crack in the wall. Then came the key moment. A memo noting Helen's request for additional registry access privileges, specifically to interdepartmental personnel rosters. Something clerks rarely asked for. Her supervisor approved it without hesitation. Helen never asked for anything. But she had just opened a door, and someone else was waiting on the other side. By the end of the briefing, the section chief leaned back, exhaling through his teeth. Volkov didn't recruit her in one move. He tuned her like a radio. The room fell silent. Every betrayal begins as a whisper you think no one hears. The file that changed everything was labeled Registry, Incident, Unresolved, March 1969. Inside, a single sheet, typed, clipped to a handwritten addendum. The incident sounded trivial on paper. Helen stayed late to correct cataloging errors and returned a stack of documents to the wrong bin. The next morning, a supervisor found them misfiled, logged it, and moved on. For ordinary clerks, it would have been minor incompetence. For Helen Vance, who had never made a clerical mistake in 5 years, it rang like an alarm bell. The Bureau reconstructed the sequence. She stayed late. No other staff present. Closed stacks access was signed under her badge. During that same hour, Embassy surveillance recorded Anton Volkov walking alone along a quiet Georgetown street, coincidentally, the same street that led to Helen's bus stop. The misfiled documents were personnel rotation summaries, names of CIA officers scheduled for transfer to Europe. Nothing catastrophic, but valuable for a foreign intelligence service mapping American movement. For ordinary clerks, it would have been minor incompetence. For Helen Vance, who had never made a clerical mistake in 5 years, it rang like an alarm bell. The Bureau reconstructed the sequence. She stayed late. No other staff present. Closed stacks access was signed under her badge. During that same hour, embassy surveillance recorded Anton Volkov walking alone along a quiet Georgetown street, coincidentally the same street that led to Helen's bus stop. The misfiled documents were personnel rotation summaries, names of CIA officers scheduled for transfer to Europe. Nothing catastrophic, but valuable for a foreign intelligence service mapping American movement. Hez telling her she deserves a life outside the shadows she files for others. A seed planted, a seed watered at precisely the right time, because in early April, Helen filed her first ever request for leave a full week. Records showed she spent 3 days in Baltimore, 2 in D.C., and 1 day unaccounted for. No receipts, no transit logs, but embassy parking surveillance caught something. A woman with a familiar posture stepped into a sedan with diplomatic plates, face obscured by a scarf, never identified. Upon returning to Langley, Helen's demeanor reportedly changed, less rigid, less quiet. The patterns endured. And her name became a whisper in training rooms, a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating the invisible. In the end, the Cold War wasn't shaped only by spies in the field. It was shaped by clerks in the halls, people whose silence echoed louder than bullets. Inside was the first confirmed sign of betrayal. A missing copy log from May 1969. One document unaccounted for, never recovered. The briefing officer spoke the line everyone in the room was thinking. She crossed the threshold, and once you cross it, there's no path back. Loyalty doesn't switch in a single moment. It erodes, one quiet compromise at a time. The next phase of Helen Vance's transformation came from what investigators later called the invisible escalation. No explosions, no dramatic breaches, just a clerk who began opening the right drawers at the wrong times. Analysts traced the pattern through access logs that at the time no one paid attention to. But in hindsight, the sequence was unmistakable. The 12th of June, 1969, 1847 hours, Helen signs into the restricted registry annex. Cross-references 2 personnel lists. Nothing unusual. The 12th of June, 1969, 1858 hours. She opens a folder stamped Europe Operational Cover, Renewals, Moscow, Prague, Vienna. She has no direct need for this file. She stays exactly 6 minutes. 6 minutes long enough for a trained asset to memorize half a roster. Then a week later, the 19th of June, 1969, 1911 hours. She repeats the pattern. This time, accessing alias refresh cycles for 3 case officers due for reassignment along the Iron Curtain. These were not random selections. These were the arteries of CIA field protection. The Bureau finally overlaid the dates with known KGB intelligence spikes. And there it was. Each one of Helen's unexplained accesses aligned within 48 hours, with Soviet adjustments in surveillance patterns overseas. Sometimes subtle, sometimes aggressive, but always intentional. The analysts realized they weren't looking at a clerk browsing files. They were looking at a controlled flow intelligence channel. Helen wasn't stealing documents, the lead investigator said. She was opening valves, small, precise leaks, not enough to raise alarms, but enough to recalibrate the KGB's understanding of CIA field posture. Then came the pivotal discovery, a single sheet recovered from the burned notebook in Box A27. Only 6 lines were legible, but they stunned the room. A. V. requests updates weekly. Use schedule gaps only. No paper, no coins, no direct. Drop at OPM bench. The cryptic rules carried the fingerprints of classic Soviet operational discipline. No paper meant no hard copies. No coins meant no payphones too risky. No direct meant no face-to-face meetings unless absolutely unavoidable. But the fourth line drew the most attention. Schedule gaps only. Helen didn't sneak. She didn't hack. She exploited her own routine, the very rigidity that once made her invisible. At this point in the briefing, the behavioral specialist dropped her pen. She didn't think she was betraying her country, she said quietly. She thought she was finally doing something someone cared about. The room absorbed that with growing unease. Because nothing is more dangerous than a person who mistakes manipulation for purpose. One final slide clicked onto the screen. Embassy surveillance photos, showing a figure placing a folded envelope beneath a bench near the Office of Personnel Management building. Foggy morning. No face visible. But the posture, the coat length, the height, it all aligned with Helen. The section chief closed the binder. She's operational now, he said. She's not just cooperating, she's contributing. And once you begin turning the key, the lock never resists again. The hardest truth for the task force to swallow was this. Helen Vance thrived precisely because the CIA never considered someone like her a threat. Her job was clerical, her demeanor quiet, her life unremarkable. She was the kind of person the system depends on and simultaneously forgets. And in the intelligence world, forgetting someone is the same as granting them freedom. Her rise as a mole didn't start with bold theft. It began with administrative visibility. Registry clerks could see everything before anyone else. Movement cables, operational amendments, recalled covers, name changes, alias expirations. They didn't shape missions, but they held the maps of everyone who did. And yet, CIA security protocols in the late 1960s treated clerical workers as passive instruments. Background checks were shallow. Monitoring was superficial. No one believed a file clerk could tilt the balance of the Cold War. That was the blind spot Helen exploited. Analysts went back to every document she touched between 1969 and 1971. They discovered something chilling. Helen didn't target high-profile officers. She targeted middle-tier operatives, the ones who traveled often, blended easily, and whose absence never triggered alarm. Officers whose identities could be subtly weakened, delayed, or exposed without creating immediate diplomatic shockwaves. The KGB didn't need spectacular wins. They needed predictable ones, and Helen delivered them. One slide in the briefing displayed a redacted cable from Vienna, 1970. Inside, a CIA officer reported being followed by a surveillance team that shouldn't have known his arrival date. His cover held, but barely. Next slide. Berlin, 1971. A dead-drop location burned the same week Helen accessed a rotation list for officers moving through West Germany. Next slide. Prague, 1970. A safe house, compromised after a routine alias cycle was leaked. One Helen had reviewed exactly 9 days earlier. The pattern wasn't just real. It was consistent. Then came the discovery that shifted the entire case. A security audit uncovered that Helen had developed shadow indexing habits, small, seemingly harmless deviations in how she cross-referenced documents. At first glance, they looked like personal quirks, but a decrypted KGB archive obtained years later confirmed otherwise. Volkov had instructed her to flag patterns through micro-deviations, not stolen files. A tiny checkmark, a repeated indentation, a deliberate misordering of 2 names, a marking only a handler, pre-briefed on her habits, could decode. It was genius. Information delivered not by transporting documents, but by editing the rhythm of her daily work. At this point, one analyst muttered, She turned the CIA registry into a telegraph. But the most devastating detail came next. A personnel psych report from 1971 noted a subtle shift. Helen had become more confident, more assertive, more grounded. Her supervisor wrote, almost proudly, "She seems to have found purpose." That purpose, the task force now knew, flowed straight into the hands of the KGB. The room fell into a heavy stillness. The section chief closed the folder slowly. "We didn't just miss the mole," he said. "We built the perfect environment for her to exist. The most dangerous infiltrators aren't the ones who break in. They're the ones invited by neglect." By 1972, the KGB had something far more valuable than raw intelligence. They had Helen's confidence. And once an asset stops fearing the system they're betraying, the real damage begins. The first sign of collapse came from Europe. A CIA officer in Budapest, codenamed Hawthorne, reported that his contact never appeared at a scheduled meeting. Hours later, Hungarian state security agents swept the area as if they'd been tipped off. Hawthorne escaped only because he sensed the trap early. 6 days before the incident, Helen had accessed an internal routing cable detailing Hawthorne's movement extension. She stayed on the file for 5 minutes longer than normal. Analysts now believe that single glance cost the agency an asset and nearly a life. But the most alarming failures accumulated slowly, like pressure cracks in a submarine hull. Alias cycles in Moscow began collapsing faster than the agency could refresh them. Safe houses once considered secure were suddenly monitored. Travel covers unraveled within days of officer arrival. And worst of all, the Soviets demonstrated uncanny insight into intent, anticipating not what the CIA had done, but what it was about to do. This wasn't luck, it was Helen. Her micro-signaling system evolved. What began as marked checkboxes and subtle reorderings became small, repeatable distortions in registry workflow. She began adjusting timing itself, filing certain documents early, delaying others, shifting classification stamps by hours or days. Tiny changes no one would question. But to the KGB, pre-briefed on her pattern, it was a live feed. Then came the strike that rattled Langley. A CIA officer in Leningrad operating under deep cover was detained during what should have been an airtight courier exchange. Headquarters was stunned. The Soviets hadn't just caught him, they'd waited for him. They'd predicted his exact window. For months, no one could explain the breach, until the burned notebook surfaced. One line stood out. Pattern sync achieved A. A for Anton Volkov. Helen wasn't feeding scattered hints anymore. She was synchronizing her daily clerical rhythm with the KGB's operational planning cycle, creating intelligence in real time. The task force examined the timeline wall again. One investigator whispered, almost to herself, "She ran the perfect long game. 15 minutes a week, and she rewrote half the field." But there was something else, something no one wanted to admit. The CIA still didn't suspect her. Internal memos from 1972 show she was twice nominated for a small commendation for exceptional consistency. Consistency, the very trait she weaponized, was praised. The section chief looked around the silent room. If Wed looked closer, would we have seen it? The behavioral specialist shook her head. Not unless you were looking for someone exactly like her, and no one was. That was the truth. The KGB didn't penetrate the CIA through brilliance. They did it through predictability, both Helen's and the agency's. Systems fail not from weaknesses, but from the assumptions no one questions. The unraveling began not with a dramatic slip, but with a budget audit. In late 1973, the CIA Inspector General launched a routine review of registry procedures. A junior auditor, new to Langley and unburdened by old assumptions, noticed something odd. Helen Vance's access logs were too clean. No spikes, no gaps, no errors, no learning curves over 9 years. "People aren't machines," he told his supervisor. "But this looks like one." It was the first time anyone questioned her perfection. The second break came from outside the agency. In January 1974, a Soviet defector in West Germany mentioned an unnamed American female administrative channel whose signals had shaped several KGB counter-surveillance successes. He didn't know her name, only that she worked in documents, not operations. The profile fit hundreds of employees, but someone on the task force had a memory, a name scribbled on a burned notebook page recovered from a Fairfax storage unit. Helen Vance. The room froze. A full internal probe was authorized. Quiet. Surgical. Only 8 people knew. They monitored her movements. They reviewed every log. They re-examined every instance of unusual precision. And then they found it. A misfiled alias renewal sheet. Just one line, misaligned by half an inch. Not enough for a suspicion, but exactly enough for a handler expecting the signal. That was her mistake. Not a dramatic failure. Just a routine. Too routine. On a cold morning in March 1974, Helen was escorted from her desk under the pretext of a classification review. She didn't resist. She didn't ask why. She simply removed her ID badge, placed it gently on the table, and folded her hands. The interrogation transcript recorded her first words. "You finally noticed. No anger, no fear, just resignation." Over the course of 19 hours, she confirmed what the timeline already showed. She met Anton Volkov 3 times. She transmitted signals through clerical patterns. She believed she was helping stabilize the global balance, not betraying it. She never took money. She did it because someone valued my existence. That single sentence broke the room. Helen Vance wasn't driven by ideology, greed, or hatred. She was driven by loneliness, weaponized by the KGB. The Department of Justice sealed her case. No trial, no publicity. Her actions were buried to avoid embarrassment. The CIA hadn't been infiltrated by a mastermind, but by a woman their system never saw. Helen disappeared into a federal holding facility under an assumed identity, where she lived out the rest of her years in quiet anonymity. Even in captivity, she kept the same rhythm. Early mornings, neat handwriting, silence. She died in 1991. No family claimed her body. But the files remained. The patterns endured. And her name became a whisper in training rooms, a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating the invisible. In the end, the Cold War wasn't shaped only by spies in the field. It was shaped by clerks in the halls, people whose silence echoed louder than bullets.